Hello, my name is Ender, and this is the face behind the voice of philosophy by choice. Today, I'm going to endeavor to read some, probably not all, of the Michael Silverstein article that appears in the edited volume by Keith Basso and Henry Selby called Meaning in Anthropology. Michael Silverstein's article in this edited volume is in chapter 2. It's called Shifters, Linguistic Categories, and Cultural Description, again by Michael Silverstein. Okay, introduction. This chapter will try to develop consequences of the statement that speech is meaningful social behavior. In itself, this statement is one of those set phrases of pidgin science that are used to ensure minimal trade relations in the contact community of linguistics and social anthropologists. It gives us no analytic or descriptive power. What I wish to do here is demonstrate that we do, in fact, already have a full, subtle language with which to describe the elaborate meaning structures of speech behavior. It is a language that speaks of the, quote, function of signs, their modes of signification, distinguishing from among the types of sign functions. This is in italics, shifters, or italics again, indexes. The meaning of this functional sign mode always involves some aspect of the context in which the sign occurs. In making the nature of this involvement clear, I hope to demonstrate that this, quote, pragmatic analysis of speech behavior in the, wait, I'm upside down over here. There we go. Okay. In the tradition extended from Pierce to Jacobson, allows us to describe the real linkage of language. Wait, sorry, I skipped ahead a ton. No, I didn't. Okay. We're going to start this last sentence again. Apologies, everyone. Um, in making the nature of this involvement clearer, I hope to demonstrate that this, quote, pragmatic analysis of speech behavior in the tradition extended from Pierce to Jacobson allows us to describe the real linkage of language to culture, and perhaps the most important aspect of the, quote, meaning of speech. At one level, language has long served anthropologists as a kind of exemplar for the nature of things cultural. It seems to display these cultural properties with clarity in the tangible medium of articulate phonetic speech. Thus, and at another level, could the analytic lessons of linguistics be transferred analogically to other social behavior, giving a kind of structuralized anthropology, or, more remarkably, could the actual linguistic parentheses, especially lexicographic and parentheses, structures of language be called culture? I will be developing the argument that this received point of view is essentially wrong. That aspect of language which has traditionally been analyzed by linguists and has served as model is just the part that is functionally unique among the phenomena of culture. Um, okay, I get it. Hence, the structural characteristics of language in this traditional view cannot really serve as a model for other aspects of culture, nor can the method of analysis. Further, linguistic or lexicographical structures that emerge from traditional grammatical analysis must of necessity bear a problematic rather than isomorphic relationship to the structure of culture. Okay, this is so my read on this for the time being, at least, is that he's saying that language is a type of cultural communication, or is like a cultural event, and it is just one among many other forms of cultural transmission or communication, but it doesn't define all of the other types of cultural communication events. Um, in fact, it is an outlier in comparison to other forms of communication, which he will heretofore elaborate on after some period of time, probably going to make the counter argument first about how linguistics has gotten it wrong up until now, and then bridge into semantics and then praxology in terms of um, explaining the right direction for linguistics. Okay, let's keep going. Um, linguistic and other communication. There we go. Okay. Linguistic and other communication. To say of social behavior that it is meaningful implies necessarily that it is communicative. That is, that the behavior is a complex of signs, parentheses, sign vehicles, and parentheses, that signal or stand for something in some respect. Such behavioral signs are significant to some persons, participants in a communicative event, and such behavior is purposive, that is, goal oriented in the sense of accomplishing, parentheses, or in failing to accomplish, and parentheses, certain ends. Oh my gosh, will you shut up, child? Sorry, I'm in a large um, play center, indoor play center in suburban America. So it gives you a flavor of the ambiance as I read very complicated things, but this is what my schedule accommodates. So this is what I'm delivering. All right, let's go back to this. Okay, that is goal oriented in the sense of accomplishing or in failing to accomplish certain ends of communication. For example, indicating one's social rank. Oh, these are my children. Hold on. All right, I'm just going to start this paragraph again. To say of social behavior that it is meaningful implies necessarily that it is communicative. That is, that the behavior is a complex of signs, parentheses, sign vehicles, and parentheses, that signal or stand for something in some respect. Such behavioral signs are significant to some persons, participants in a communicative event, and such behavior is purposive, that is, goal oriented in the sense of accomplishing or in failing to accomplish certain ends of communication. For example, indicating one's social rank, reporting an occurrence, affecting a cure for a disease, and so forth. In general, then, we can say that people are constituted as a society with a certain culture to the extent that they share the same means of social communication. All right, so this is an explanation here of the other types of cultural events outside of linguistic systems. And they're including, Michael Silverstein is including um, or trying to say as the example that there are other types of cultural events that are communicated, such as someone's social status or rank, that they're part of a certain language group, maybe showing deference to somebody else, or even speech acts, which I'll talk about shortly, where change is affected in a cultural sense, like the institution of marriage. So someone saying, I do, is an example of a certain type of cultural communication that exists beyond just the linguistic or the language elements and grammar of that linguistic sentence or construct. Okay. Language as a system of communication has the same characteristics as the rest of culture. So, in order to distinguish analytical subparts of culture as a language, we have traditionally distinguished among types of communicative events on the basis of the signaling medium. In the case of language, the signaling medium is articulate speech, and events can be isolated on this basis. Speech events. By such analysis, a speech event endowed with an overt goal in a socially shared system of such purposive functions consists of some sequence of speech behaviors in which some speaker or speakers signal to some hearer or hearers by means of a system of phonetic sign vehicles called speech messages or utterances. The utterances are organized into a system where the participants, by virtue of their knowledge of linguistic code or grammar, the speech event takes place with this participant's code or grammar. Oh, sorry, that was wrong. Okay, the speech event takes place with the participants in given positions or loci and over a certain span of time. So the idea of like a turn exchange or set number of utterances before it is the other participants' turns would be an example of what he's trying to describe. Um, Many other characteristics of such speech events must also be taken into consideration. Among them, the other sociological aspects of the individuals in the roles of speaker and hearer, which are frequently salient in defining the event. The prior speech events, if any, the gestural or kinetic communication that invariably accompanies spoken language, the distinction between roles of hearer and audience, and so forth. The description of the speech event must minimally take into account these fundamental defining variables. Speech events, so defined, moreover, are co occurrent with events based on distinct signaling media, and these together make up large scale cultural routines. Descriptively, the simplest speech events would be those which themselves constituted the entire goal directed social behavior. It is doubtful that such events exist. In our own culture, reading a scholarly paper can become close to being a speech event pure and simple, the purpose of which is expressible in terms of informative discourse among social categories of scholars. The possibility of distinct forms of symbolism that can be involved in these events is not at issue. I am dealing here only with the purposive nature of the speech event in a system of social action. The more embedded speech events are, those which are part of such large-scale cultural enterprises or complex rituals, including speech, song, dance, dress, etc., where the meaning of the speech behavior in the speech event is usually integrally linked to the presence of these other signaling media. I'm going to read that one again because it feels significant. All right. The possibility of distinct forms of symbolism that can be involved in these events is not at issue. I am dealing here only with the purposive nature of this speech event in a system of social action. The more embedded speech events are, and these are the examples of more embedded speech events, those which are part of a large scale cultural enterprise as complex rituals, including speech, song, dance, dress, etc., where the meaning of the speech behavior in the speech event is usually intricately linked to the presence of these other signaling media. Analytically, the problem of trying to give the meanings of signals in such a situation is very complex. I mean, my interpretation, again, is always going to be my interpretation, is that he's um, being a little bit cheeky, I think, uh, in kind of setting out in a description of the speech event as first describing it in a very like linguistic manner of like what it's composed of and its grammatical elements. So using that coded language, and then poking fun at academics by saying that academics probably have what is closest to this ideal state of culture, which is a large scale of cultural routines, which is kind of a romantic colonial approach to ethnology when it first started, right? Is this idea of like pure and total culture. Okay. And then he moves into his definition of a speech event, which will be slightly demarcated, I guess, in relation to what is it, Parsons, Searle? I forget who did Speech Act, but yeah, the like author of Speech Act, Austin. That's it. Yeah. So he'll be like, oh yeah, speech acts. Like I have a different definition than you know might be typically used today. But sorry, I'm getting a little like ahead of myself with talking about Austin. I'm just going to keep going, but I'm just saying he's kind of being tongue in cheek in using the fashion discourse of romantic ethnology during the colonial era, and then saying like, oh, it would only persist in a kind of culture of academics, and then saying, but like, okay, let's actually think about some of these traditional ethnographic events like dancing, um, weddings, religious ceremonies, certain garbs that are all considered performative. And it actually isn't that much different. So let's go talk about its minutia. Okay, moving forward then from this one, referential speech events. But the ultimate justification for the segmentation of speech from other signaling media lies in one of the purposive uses that seems to distinguish speech behavior from all other communicative events, the function of pure reference, or in terms more culturally bound than philosophical, the function of description or, quote, telling about. The referential function of speech, which he just defined as the of pure reference, culturally bound. Let's see. Yeah. So referential function is telling about something. So it's a concept or a memory or an event that you're recounting to somebody in a way that they'll understand. The referential function of speech can be characterized as communication by propositions, predications, descriptive of states of affairs, subject to verification in some cases of objects and events, taken as representations of truth in others. Reference, so characterized, is a communicative event, and the utterances of referential discourse are made up of sign units in grammatical arrangements, the meaning of the whole being a descriptive or referring proposition. It is this referential function of speech and its characteristic side mode, the semantico-referential sign, that has formed the basis of linguistic theory and linguistic analysis in the Western tradition. I have a note here um, that I don't think that this is his proposition. I think he's still building up to what his critical contribution to linguistic anthropology is, which is likely to come at the end of this first section. So let's continue because the argument's being built up. And again, you have to, in this kind of like tradition of writing, it's typical to have a period in the writing, and it shouldn't be too long, where you talk about the inspiration for your um, theoretical or innovative contribution to the science of anthropology, and in this case, science of linguistics. And so he's going through the motions of like why the others aren't satisfactory, and then we'll flip the table or flip the deck and start talking about how his contribution and interpretation is correct or adds value to the overall history of the discipline. All right, so let's keep, he's still building. Let's keep going. Okay, let's see. I am going to read this over just because now that you have that context, it might make a difference. Reference, so characterized, is a communicative event, and the utterances of referential discourse are made up of sign units in grammatical arrangements, the meaning of the whole being a descriptive or referring proposition. It is thus referential function of speech, and its characteristic sign mode, the semantico-referential sign, that has formed the basis of linguistic theory and linguistic analysis in the Western tradition. It's interesting that he bothered to put in Western tradition. Referential linguistic categories. All linguistic analysis of the traditional sort proceeds on the basis of the contribution of elements of utterances in the referential or denotative value of the whole. And it is on this basis that the traditional segmentation, description, and definition of all linguistic categories is made. Our standard ideas about the significant segmentation of utterances all rests on sameness or difference of utterances in terms of referring or describing propositions, coded in speech. Plural versus singular, quote, number. For example, as a pure referential linguistic category, it makes me think of Kant. This type of argument always makes me think of Kant and then Saussure. Okay. Plural versus singular, number, for example, as a pure referential linguistic category, can be analyzed by the contribution of such markers in propositions describing more than one versus not more than one entity. In English, this is illustrated by, and this is italics, for example, the boys run versus the boy runs, where nouns suffixed with s and unsuffixed verb signal the category of plural number subject, and unsuffixed noun and verb suffixed with s signal the category of singular number subject. Thus, we segment, and there's a bunch of Greek characters, which I'm going to skip over because I don't know them. Durative or progressive versus punctual, quote, aspect as a pure referential category contributes to propositions describing events as continuous or ongoing, parentheses, where they are not necessarily so, and parentheses, versus momentous or complete. In English, this is illustrated by italics for emphasis. The boy was jumping versus the boy jumped, with segmentation, again, a bunch of Greek letters, B and ED represented by was. Any form of grammatical analysis in this referential mode, from Greco Roman to transformational generative, defines the signs, the categories, and their rules of combination and arrangement in this fashion. All of our analysis, or all of our analytic techniques and formal descriptive machinery have been designed for referential signs, which contribute to referential utterances in referential speech events. We shall see below that certain among the referential categories cause difficulties with this whole approach. Okay, there's a little teaser there, I guess. When we speak of linguistic categories, we mean categories of this referential kind. Hence, one of the principal reasons social functions of speech have not been built into our analysis of language. The sign modes of most of what goes on in the majority of speech events are not referential. All right, I'm going to reread that. Okay. All of our analytic techniques and formal descriptive machinery have been designed for referential signs. And this is the we here, or our, is the Greco-Roman transformational generative, I guess, approach to linguistics. All of our analytic techniques and formal descriptive machinery have been designed for referential signs, which contribute to referential utterances and referential speech events. Parentheses, we shall see below that certain among the referential categories cause difficulties with this whole approach. End parentheses. When we speak of linguistic categories, we mean categories of this referential kind. Hence, one of the principal reasons social functions of speech have not been built into our analyses of language. The sign modes of most of what goes on in the majority of speech events are not referential. Sorry, I have to get out of this chair. Okay. I'll move this back. There. All right, so I think a good parallel for understanding what he's saying is no wonder we cannot identify all of the different type of significance in language or in communication events is because the very language that we use to study it is not predisposed to it's predisposed to referential events because it gestures to ideal types or constructs. and it can only see what it has already set out to define. And so unconscious or non-linguistic based elements in a communication event, like maybe your posture indicating attitude or interest um, towards your social partner, communicates a lot more than maybe what on the surface you're saying in your words. And those elements of one's posture or attitude aren't hard coded in language. And so it makes it um, more difficult to describe the added element of a communication event because it's not hard coded in the language. And so that's what he's trying to say. All right, let's keep going. Semantic and linguistic analysis. Oh, and I have here noted that this is when he flips the table. So this is now where he's going to talk about his contribution to linguistics. Right, semantics and linguistic analysis. The study of the quote meaning of linguistic signs is usually called semantics. It is clear from the way I have characterized traditional linguistic investigations, however, that the actual object of study of semantics has been the referential meanings of utterances, of the words and categories and arrangements in terms of which we can analyze them. For the purposes of this chapter, the term will be restricted in this way, so that semantics is the study of pure referential meaning, embodied in propositions coded by speech. Oh, so that's interesting. So he's actually um, really boxing in semantics in terms of its meaning to actually, ooh, that's kind of a diss, because semantics is considered the more um, enlightened linguistic approach. And he's actually like defining it as being the thing that he just dismissed. Um, ouch. Okay. So he's basically saying that semantics is that like ideal conceptual construct that is only visible through language, or can only be articulated, can comment on language because it is in that language. All right. So the other modes of communication of cultural events aren't hard coded, so they're not appearing in semantics, which only works with the hard coded linguistic elements of communication. All right. From an operational point of view, all grammatical analysis of the traditional sort depends on this semanticity. To be able to analyze linguistic categories, we must be able to give evidence about the semantic relations of parts of sentences. We must ultimately be able to say, in other words, whether or not a certain stretch of language is semantically equivalent within the grammar to some other stretch of language. So this is like translation, like traditional understanding that we have of a translator, or the role of a translator is to replace um, with like high fidelity to the original speech or intention of the person a semantically equivalent phrase or utterance in another language, which we all know by now is not possible. Like there's going to be elements that are cultural that aren't communicated through the translation into another language because they're culturally learned, steeped in tradition, context bound, etc. So I feel like we should all know that. We must ultimately be able to say, in other words, whether or not certain stretches of language is semantically equivalent within the grammar to some other stretch of language. By determining such equivalent relations, we can build up a notion of defining or glossing certain grammatical stretches of a language in terms of others. In terms of other languages, but glossing is itself a referential speech event. Metasemantics. Glossing speech events take language itself, in particular the semantics of language, as the referent. And I would say if you want to zone out You can zone out for this next section because it's just going to be a repetition of the previous section, applying it to um, take down semantics as not being sufficient enough. All right, let's keep going. Glossing speech events take language itself, in particular, the semantics of language as the referent or object of description. These events use language to describe the semantics of language and are thus metasemantic referential speech events. Such metasemantic speech events are the basis of all grammatical analysis and description, and hence of all semantic description as well. They are the basic activity of the traditional linguistics, which may be seen as the discovery of the glosses of a language, of the class of all possible metasemantic speech events in the language. Leonard Bloomsfield, 1933, quote, fundamental postulate, end quote, is essentially one about the semantic and formal equivalence of certain sentences that underlie utterances within a speech community. Similarly, such semantic equivalence at the level of phrases and sentences has become the stock in trade of the transformational grammarian, who postulates a common, quote, underlying structure for semantically equivalent, quote, surface syntactic arrangements. But it is interesting that metasemantic speech events are a natural occurrence in everyday speech, a culturally learned speech function. In our society, parents are constantly glossing words for children by using grammatically complex but semantically equivalent expressions that make the same contribution to reference of utterances as the glossed items. Um, I didn't have this experience growing up. I think maybe this shows Michael Silverstein's age with this idea that parents, especially I imagine the mother, took on the role of correcting the grammar of their children if they were to use, let's say, um, maybe a hyphenation of a word like is not and is using isn't. That might be considered um, a class, I don't know, a class act. So they might get corrected and corrected in such a way where that specific form of speech is being flagged as being ungrammatical or not grammatically correct. And so that creates a glossing over the language of that there are certain rules and natural functions inherent in the language itself that can be codified and ratified. All right. Let me just find out where I am. Oh, yeah, we just talked about parents. The metasemantic property of language, the property that makes semantic analysis and hence semantically based grammar possible, is the one that is unique to language and upon which rests the speech function of pure reference. It is what makes language unique among all the cultural codes for social communication. So now he's gesturing back to his introductory summary. Anthropologists have long analyzed ritual, myth, and other media of social behavior as making symbolic statements about categories of social structure. But of what medium other than referential speech can we say that the behavioral signs can describe the meanings of the signs themselves? All right, I'm going to repeat that because it's kind of complicated. Anthropologists have long analyzed ritual, myth, and other media of social behavior as making symbolic statements about categories of social structure. But of what medium, other than referential speech, can we say that the behavioral signs can describe the meaning of the signs themselves? I'm going to read the next sentence and then see if that explains what he's trying to say here, because it's, again, I don't know, like kind of a typical academic style of writing where there are jabs and teasing, or like sometimes joshing around with other academics that are your peers, or where there's a strong cult following around a certain type of um, philosophical or social theory approach to analysis. And so I like to try and find out what that reference might be, and I'm not quite sure here. So I want to just read a little more and then meditate on it a bit. Okay, okay, so we just read that. But of what medium other than referential speech can we say that the behavioral signs can describe the meanings of the signs themselves? There are no naturally occurring metamythic events in the same way that there are metalinguistic ones, nor meta-ritualistic events with the same functional possibilities. It is in other functional properties of language, which can be exploited in speech events, that the commonality of language and many other cultural media lies. Okay. There are no naturally occurring metamythic events in the same way that there are meta-linguistic ones, nor meta-ritualistic events with the same functional possibilities. It is in other functional properties of language, which can be exploited in speech events, that the commonality of language and many other cultural media lies. Okay, yeah. So he's saying that the meaning of culture cannot be identified by um, these like formulaic grammatical structures and positionings of like noun and object and adverb, because they exist in the accumulation of what's between the words. So that's like this idea that an underlying ether of um, time and like context, which is inherently cultural and social, is what is communicated outside of a semantic analysis. But they're still in language, and it's just that we've separated the two, but have never separated ritual or myth from ritual and myth. Okay, let's move forward. I feel good about that. It's interesting because it is the cultural anthropology argument applied to a linguistic setting, which makes me think linguistics and anthropology probably didn't have too much overlap in terms of their knowledge systems. And the uniqueness maybe that Michael Silverstein brings is to actually label the word that others did not label, about the social value of certain types of communication is culture. And then once you do that, you can create a new set of rules and terms and metalinguistics around it. So good job. All right. Simultaneous non-referential functions. Speech events that do not have referential functions accomplish socially constituted ends comparable to those of non-speech events. For example, it is frequently through speech that we set social boundaries on an interaction rather than through the physical separation of participants. To characterize such behavior abstractly, we note that we can choose the language in which we speak as to preclude comprehension on the part of some individuals present. I do that with my kids. My partner and I speak in Japanese, and they've never learned Japanese. Um, we can use the language all understand, but with pronomial markers that make the intended boundaries of participation clear. We can use phraseology only some can understand. We can spell out the written representations of words in the presence of those illiterate in some written language. Aha, kids, and so forth. This purposive privacy function of the speech behavior is simultaneous with, but analytically distinct from, whatever referential function there is in the event for speaker and intended hearers. for only they participate in those roles in the referential communication. One of the most interesting aspects of speech behavior, in fact, is this multifunctionality of what appear to be utterances in sequence. The traditional the traditionally recognized referential nature of some parts of utterances seeming to have intercalated many other functional elements simultaneously. From the point of view of the traditional semantico-referential linguistics, those other functional modes of language use seem to be, quote, riding on, end quote, descriptive propositions. But this is a rather limited point of view, for it takes considerable analysis of the use of such speech itself to characterize what is going on in such cases as those given above. The only behavioral data are the speech signals themselves. To say, for example, that the speaker is using a different, quote, language, just in the semantico referential sense, presupposes a grammatical description of each of the distinct referential media, and hence presupposes the isolation of the referential function of speech in two distinct systems of semantic signals. Yeah, he's basically saying you'd have to do so much gymnastics, like mental gymnastics, to or loopholes to make the grammatical referential. Um, See my kids. Okay, you'd have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to like get the rules of grammar set out by these earlier linguistics to make this referential component of language make sense. So, the functional analysis of a given use of speech behavior requires that we can contrast signs, all other things remaining the same. From the point of view of functional analysis, then, we must make sophisticated hypotheses of isofunctionality or comparability of function of the signaling media before any structural description is justifiable. Reference and performative speech. Just like reference, however, other uses of speech get some socially constituted, quote, work done. They accomplish or, quote, perform something, whether achieving privacy, as in the example above, or marking the social status of the participants, or making a command for someone to do something, or affecting a permanent change in social status. For example, marrying two people or knighting someone. Much recent analysis has been focused on this performative aspect of language use in what I have termed purposive or functional speech events. Following upon the work of Austin, some have distinguished between, quote, performative aspects of speech and the, quote, semantic content, parentheses, the term not rigorously circumscribed as it is here, and parentheses, other part, others, particularly the philosopher Searle, 1969, have distinguished, quote, speech acts represented by utterances as distinct from other propositional content. Parentheses. It is somewhat unfortunate, by the way, that, quote, speech act has been used as a term for the level of purposive functional speech events, since I will be using it in another sense below, and parentheses. All these approaches, in other words, start with a basically semantico-referential linguistic analysis from which the linguistic categories, the grammatical arrangements, etc., emerge in the traditional way. They take in they t- they tack onto this analysis a description of how these semantico-referential categories can be, quote, used performatively. This approach entirely misses the point that referential speech events are, a fortiori, speech events endowed with the same kind of purposefulness as other speech events. Reference is one kind of linguistic performance among many. And I'm going to repeat that because that's been his main point he's trying to hit. throughout this portion of the paper. Reference, so referential speech. Reference is one kind of linguistic performance among many. Read cultural performance. The linguistic categories that emerge from analysis of speech in the semantico-referential modes are not necessarily the same as those that emerge from other functional modes, and it is presumptuous to speak of arrangements of a basically propositional nature being, quote, used in other ways. The physical signals of distinct functional modes of speech may be partially alike, since they seem to be superimposed in the same formal utterances, but the meanings in this larger sense of functional cultural meaning are different, and hence we have distinct signs. The priority of reference in establishing linguistic categories and structure rests squarely on the manipulability of this mode by the meta-linguistic property. But reference itself is just one, perhaps actually a minor one, among the performative or speech act functions of speech. One second. All right, I'm going to read this again because, again, this is his main thesis for the opening section of the article. But reference itself is just one, perhaps actually a minor one, among the, quote, performative or, quote, speech act functions of speech. We do not use basically, quote, descriptive linguistic structure to accomplish other communicative goals. Description happens to be one of those goals, one that overlaps in formal structure of signals with other functional ends. Abbreviatory extensions. In certain cases, of course, the extension of descriptive referential language to other performative uses is patent. One such class of events is conversational abbreviations used as requests. A statement to another person in a room with an open window, such as, quote, I'm cold, or it's cold in here, could lead to a discussion until the interlocutor, so the person they're talking to, is asked to close the window and does so. Or more naturally, for sophisticated persons in our society, we can abbreviate the statement itself leading to the accomplishment of the action. So it's basically saying, in quote, polite or sophisticated society, one need only gesture to the fact that they're cold for it to have a consequence, like a real social consequence of someone closing the window and like physically changing a situation. I think now, my opinion is that now that is considered being indirect. So rather than directly commanding someone to close the door, you can suggest that you'd like the door closed, and that is a polite way of making a personal or selfish request. Um, I think it's often tied to like feminine forms of speech, feminine forms of comportment. So you often hear women or people that recognize themselves as women socially and personally are more likely to use this indirect or polite coded form of speech. It's like gender coded. All right, let's continue. Um, so, yeah, that's what quote is meant by polite here. Several subtypes of statements require such experience and deduction based on full forms of linguistic sequences. But such a seemingly descriptive utterance used as abbreviatory request events are very circumscribed and constitute a level of delicacy of manipulatory signaling highly susceptible to failure. In general, the point holds that descriptive reference is one among the speech functions, not the basis of all others. Pragmatic, pragmatic meanings of linguistic signs. So now you should clue back in if you've just been zoning out. The linguistic signs that underlie utterances, then, appear in speech that serves many socially constituted functions. The italics meanings of such signs as they emerge from grammatical analysis are traditionally described in terms of their contribution to referring propositional speech. Of necessity, a partial description. The problem set for us when we consider the actual broader uses of language is to describe the total meaning of constituent linguistic signs, only part of which is semantic in our narrowed terminology. So now we're expanding the realm of possibility of what could be considered um, a linguistic sign or um, something that's symbolic and carries meaning or function that is beyond the words themselves. We must begin with the facts of purposive utterances in speech events and isolate their several functions. Linguistic signs have distinct kinds of meanings which depend on their contribution to several kinds of functional speech events we can isolate. We can see in this way that while some linguistic signs have semantic meanings, contributing to reference. Others have non semantic meanings, contributing to other distinct speech functions. In general, we can call the study of the meaning of linguistic signs relative to their communicative functions pragmatics, and these more broadly conceived meanings are then pragmatic meanings. Semantic meaning is, of course, in one sense, a special form of pragmatic meaning, the mode of signification of signs that contributes to pure referential function. This fits exactly with the discovery that grammatical analysis of the traditional sort is equivalent to discovering the class of all possible metalinguistics or glossing referential speech events. Pragmatic categories. General, pra- General pragmatic meaning of signs and more particular semantic meanings are largely superimposed in the formal signals of speech. In fact, there is a class of signs called referential indexes, to be characterized below, in which the two modes are linked in the same categories, segmentable and isolable, simultaneously in at least two functional modes, one referential, one not. By examining only those categories that unite at least two functional modes in the same isolable speech fraction, for example, in English, deictic, this or that, we might get the mistaken idea that the superimposition is always of discrete referential categories intercalated with otherwise functional ones. So he's just restating his previous statement. If speech consisted only of pure referential categories, parentheses, which traditional linguistic theory postulates, end parentheses, and referential indexes, then all isolable segments would have semantic meanings, and some residual segments would have an additional pragmatic mode. This is false, as we shall see, since utterances include non-referential and hence non-semantic formal features. So again, just kind of like an expansion on what he just said. Um, and a little tongue in cheek, trying to just like make sure you're still paying attention and following along. It makes me wonder when, like, why do academics write this way? Like, I get it's fun. I'm not gonna lie, it's like fun, and it's fun to take a dig at someone, and it's fun to feel like you're smarter than someone. It's just so antiquated, I guess. It just feels so antiquated. Like, why can't you just say what you have to say rather than prove that you're an expert on all other forms of thought that came before you? Everyone has to have this like coming of age story in whatever academic text they're writing. Um, like what you emerged out of, or how you're part of this long historical tradition. Anyway, that's my own gripe. It is thus possible to have entirely distinct analysis of the same overt speech material from different functional points of view. The linguistic signs that have various pragmatic meanings are only apparently represented at the, quote, surface of speech in continuous utterances. We may recall Victor Hugo's couplet, and this is in another language, I don't know. Gal amant de la reine à la tour magnami, gal amant de la reine à la tour magne animes. So I studied Japanese, not romantic, and a romantic language, so I apologize for butchering that. Analysis in general leads to this kind of superimposed structural heterogeneity in um, depending on the functional mode of the pragmatic meanings of utterances. Yes. So those, I'm guessing that whatever that statement was had two different interpretations or two different possible meanings, and the only way to have known how it functioned would have been to participate in the other forms of meaning that co-occurred in that utterance. Once we realize that the distinct pragmatic meanings yield distinct analyses of utterances, we can sever our dependencies on reference as the controlling functional mode of speech, dictating our traditional segmentations and recognition of categories. We can then concentrate on the manifold social pragmatics that are common to language and every other form of socially constituted communication in society. All right, so my next recording will be of the next section of this text. Again, this is by Michael Silverstein, Shifters, Linguistic Categories, and Cultural Descriptions in the edited volume of um, Meaning and Anthropology by Keith Basso and Henry Selby, edited by. All right, thank you so much for joining. The next section will be the nature of linguistic signs.